Hope you can hear me. Hi. Thank you for waiting a couple minutes. We started a little late because there was a little traffic. It's okay that I start, right? It's okay to start? Yeah. I'm going for it. My name's Suzanne Furman. I am a new member to the NFRPP Advisory Board, and I'm so happy to welcome you tonight to tonight's program entitled Democracy Under Threat, and tonight we explore gerrymandering. NFRPP is a nonpartisan organization that informs, educates, and motivates the public on key public policy issues through lecture series of regularly scheduled programs. Panel discussions and events feature knowledgeable experts in the field who present a wide array of factual evidence with a dash of an opinion or two. Thank you to our co-sponsors. They're the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn, League of Women Voters of Northern Valley, and Ridgewood Jolt. And a quick note, NFRPP and two of our co-sponsors, the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn and the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley, are all three nonpartisan groups who do not support specific candidates, but do support being an educated voter. I also want to remind you that on Thursday, November 2nd, we have a really great program coming up entitled Money in Politics, Free Speech or Corrupting, and we will explore the influence that money has in the political system. It probably has a little bit of an influence. And if you happen to have an idea for a program, please let us know, because there's certainly no shortage of ideas out there, and we would love to hear about what you're interested in. And finally, a shameless plug, if you really like coming to these events, I noticed a lot of you guys are contributing. Thank you so, so much. If you haven't really considered contributing, please consider. Think of us your local source for facts and really interesting events. And now I am going to turn the program over to Margaret Lascala, NFRPP's Issues Coordinator, who will introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Okay, so that was a great job explaining that this is the first of two events that we'll be hosting on the topic of democracy under threat. So tonight our first speaker is Tom Wolfe. Tom is counsel with the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. His focus is redistricting litigation and matters pending before the U.S. Supreme Court. Tom's articles and op-ed pieces on racial and partisan gerrymandering have appeared in Time, The Hill, U.S. News & World Reports, and several other major publications. Also with us is David Becker. David is the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Election, Innovation, and Research. Prior to founding CEIR, David was the Director of the Elections Program at the Pew Charitable Trusts, and he's also served under two administrations as a senior trial attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice's voting section. We welcome them both.
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Wolfe. Can you hear me? All right, great. I have my iPad out, so maybe I'm on Twitter or maybe I'm looking at the script for my talk. You can be the judge of that. So partisan gerrymandering has moved into the national spotlight recently. It's gotten a significant amount of coverage in major national newspapers, magazines. It's all over Twitter. It's all over Facebook. A lot of that attention recently has been driven by a U.S. Supreme Court case, Gill v. Whitford, which involves a challenge on partisan gerrymandering grounds to Wisconsin's General Assembly map. The court heard oral arguments in that case in early October, and so that's sort of, kind of how all the furor got built, or the frenzy around the case. Whitford's coming at a crucial moment. It's one that a lot of people, myself included, think is sort of a turning point for our democracy, potentially. Extreme partisan gerrymandering of the kind that we've seen in Wisconsin has been running rampant this decade, and if steps aren't taken soon to rein it in, it's only going to get worse. And in the meantime, we've been suffering a lot of very severe practical and legal harms. We know that in 2021, like clockwork, the maps around the country are going to be redrawn en masse. And everything that we saw happen in 2010, 2011, when maps were redrawn around the country, will probably be done again, and be done to an even more extreme extent where possible. With better funding, with more sophisticated map drawing tools, with richer data and faster computer processing speeds, we're likely going to see gerrymandering wars that are going to be unleashed by both parties, and voters like ourselves are going to get caught in the middle. So there's good news here and there's bad news here. There are reasons to be optimistic that the plaintiffs in Whitford are going to win. I can't guarantee that. I'm an appellate attorney. I won't guarantee anything, but there are at least reasons to be optimistic about what could happen there. And despite a lot of early reporting about this case, Whitford isn't going to solve all of the problems that we have with our redistricting processes and our legislatures. So it's best to understand what's going on in the courts as sort of one tool that we can use to combat partisan gerrymandering, but it's one tool in a kit, and we're going to need to use the whole kit if we're really going to try to start slimming down the nature of the threat here. So what I'm going to do over the course of about 20 minutes, if I can point the clicker in the right direction, which seems to be an important thing, is I'll take you through a little bit more about the problem of extreme gerrymandering, and then I'll talk a little bit about the opportunities. These are pretty grim times. I wake up every morning and I open Twitter and I know that I shouldn't, and it frequently makes me feel pretty awful about the state of our democracy, so I feel like the worst thing I can do is end your evening with some kind of downer. I want to give you some sort of hope, while also remaining honest to the fact that this is a pretty extreme problem. So let's go. So whenever you talk about partisan gerrymandering, it's very important to define your terms. And the main reason here is because partisan gerrymandering as a term over the course of time has become this kind of catch-all for everything we dislike about redistricting, our maps, our individual legislators that represent us, and our legislatures. That's just too big of a problem to really productively get your hands around. So I want to narrow the conversation a little bit, and I want to talk about the particular problem that we're seeing in Whitford and a few other places. This isn't the problem of funny-looking shapes in terms of districts. It's not really a problem about incumbent protection. It's a problem about how maps perform, and that means how certain maps favor certain parties over others. That problem is something that we're calling extreme partisan gerrymandering. Basically, what happens in extreme partisan gerrymandering is you have one party that uses the redistricting process to lock in a majority or even a supermajority for a whole decade. It's a tactic for entrenching one party in power, regardless of how the voters actually vote. So again, we're not concerned in the first instance about districts looking weird. We're not really all that concerned in the first instance about whether incumbents can or can't be unseated. Those things that usually are sort of symptoms of a deeper problem, and the deeper problem is this one-party entrenchment problem. Extreme partisan gerrymandering is what happened in Wisconsin, and a lot of the discourse around partisan gerrymandering tends to get very theoretical very quickly, like focusing on obscure aspects of US constitutional law or intricacies of advanced statistics. But I actually think the facts here are pretty straightforward and they're pretty shocking. So in 2010, there was a wave election in Wisconsin and elsewhere, and that put Republicans in charge with a majority in the legislature. Because of that, they had control also over the redistricting process. The heads of the Republican caucus in the legislature hired a local law firm. The local law firm set up a secret offsite map room. That was, offsite, it was located elsewhere in Madison. Then they hired a bunch of legislative aides and consultants. They gave them keys to the map room, and they left them in there for 4 months. And the consultants and aides were working very hard. So what they did was they worked with a statistician who was based in Oklahoma to create a series of potential maps. And with each map they would draw, they would then run a series of elections. So they wouldn't just look at, well, how would this map perform if this were the map in 2010 and everyone voted the way they did in 2010. They'd simulate basically all the reasonable electoral outcomes that you could have. So what if Democrats had 5 more points statewide than they did? What if they had 5 fewer? What if Republicans were up 7? And they basically kept pushing the maps further and further and further to get more and more and more seats. But the really important thing here was they weren't just trying to get as many seats as possible for one election. They were trying to get as many seats as possible for a decade. So what they were trying to do is basically optimize the number of seats they could hold with the number of seats they could hold safely. what that means practically is, in a lot of cases, you create a few districts that have a lot of Democratic voters, so they win by large margins and their votes are kind of wasted. And then you create a lot of 53-47 Republican districts that you know your party is going to win, but you're not going to win it by a huge margin, and you can kind of shift your good voters to other districts to help win those too. The Democrats were not involved at all in the process, but even the Republican rank and file were not involved in the process. So what this was really about was what the leaders of the state party wanted, not even what the individual members of their party wanted. So at the end of the process, when they did get the Republican rank and file involved, they had them sign non-disclosure agreements, and then they showed them only their single district, and it was basically a take it or leave it thing, and there was actually no leave it, so it was just take it. They then created this map, and the idea was, and this was in the notes of an aide that came out over the course of discovery, was that, in their words, this map would determine who's here 10 years from now. That's how it was sold. And it ended up working really well because, like I said, they spent 4 months doing it, and they spent a lot of time and money and a lot of intellectual heft doing this. So in 2012, the Republicans got 48.6% of the statewide vote. They got 60 out of 99 seats in the General Assembly. That's at more than 60%, and they haven't given up that majority since. So extreme gerrymanders like Wisconsin's don't happen everywhere. On the basis of a study that colleagues of mine did and published earlier this year called Extreme Maps, about 6 congressional districts evidence signs of extreme gerrymandering. I can go into more depth in question and answer about how we arrive at that map.
Could you read?
Sure. So the light pink says consistent and high partisan bias under 1 measure. The dark red says consistent and high partisan bias under 3 measures. The measures they're referring to are measures of what's called partisan asymmetry. It's basically a way of figuring out whether a map treats both parties equally in the way they convert votes to seats. You might have heard about the efficiency gap in relation to Whitford. The efficiency gap is one of those measures. And then on the basis of work that an expert did for Whitford, it looks like about a dozen state legislative maps also evidence signs of being extreme partisan gerrymanders. It's a question of durability. So, like whether, sorry, not durability, how they perform under a series of different measures. Right, they're all bad, yeah. Okay, so this isn't a problem everywhere, but where it does happen, it's an extreme problem. So, and you can break this down under a couple different dimensions. So you've got, I think in the first instance, legislative dysfunction. Like the legislators know that redistricting is really important because it basically determines whether they are going to still be in office or not. So every 10 years, everyone gets at each other's throats to try to win the races that are going to swing control of redistricting. Then they're at each other's throats to control who draws the maps. Then they're at each other's throats to produce the maps that are most advantageous to them. So by the time they finally get around to doing what they're supposed to be doing as legislators, they hate each other and they can't get anything done. It cements in majorities that, as we've seen in Wisconsin, can't be voted out. And when you can't vote your legislators out, it's pretty hard to claim that your legislature is accountable. It also allows, this is something I'll also touch on a little bit later, but you'll notice, for instance, with these congressional maps, a lot of these states are battleground states. Now, what ends up happening is one party gets control of the process in a state that's really purple that has like lively back and forth debates about important policy issues. But then one party gets a supermajority that can't get voted out of office, and then all of a sudden you get sort of extreme legislation on one side. So North Carolina would be an example. Wisconsin's not on this map because it's not congressional, but is another example where most voters won't even really recognize what the legislature is doing as something that's kind of like mainstream and acceptable. Related to that, we also have basic constitutional problems, and that's something I'm also available to go into further depth with in the question and answer, but these raise significant First and 14th Amendment concerns. And the Constitution is presumably important. I think that it still is important today, although sometimes I have doubts. And so, we have this sort of raft of practical and legal problems. Okay, so the other issue is now that the problem's only set to get worse. So, I've called extreme gerrymandering a tactic, and the reason is, there are a couple different ways you can gain maps that people have tried to do over the course of time. In 2010, extreme gerrymandering was sort of a new thing because it's been enabled by technology and data, and not everyone knew how to do it, but now everyone knows how to do it. So I'm anticipating in any kind of state where the conditions are there, people are going to try. And what is important also here is that, and why these things emerged at the time they did, there's this sort of chestnut when people talk about gerrymandering that I try to resist. So a lot of people's presentations start with the original gerrymander. What was happening in the early 19th century isn't what's happening now. People didn't know what they know about voters now. They didn't have the power to manipulate the data in the way that they do now. And so what you are now seeing are not just attempts by one person to kind of rig the game in his favor for an election or two. You have one party setting up a whole state for a whole 10-year period. And that's something we can do now that we weren't able to do before. And all of those capacities have only been increasing since 2010. So Paul Smith, who argued Whitford for the plaintiffs in front of the Supreme Court, put it more colorfully than I can. He's good with words. And as he explained to the court, we're about to see a festival of copycat gerrymandering, the likes of which this country has never seen. I thought that was good. I don't know what Chief Justice Roberts thought about that. Yeah. So, opportunities. I hope I've convinced you at this point that this is, I'm sorry?
Can you turn the sound up?
Turn the sound up? Or maybe talk closer to the mic, is that better? Okay. So I hope I've convinced you that this is a serious problem, and now the question is, what are the levers of change here? The courts are one, and there are a few others, but none of them are going to fix the problem, so it's important to kind of see all of this as one set, and what happens in one area, particularly in the courts, is likely to influence what we see happening in other areas. So we know that the courts have to get involved in curbing extreme partisan gerrymandering because the very nature of the problem is that it doesn't have a political solution. Like, you can't, if you don't like the way your legislators are drawing your maps, you can't vote them out because they've drawn the maps, so you can't vote them out. So we need the court to come in and actually be a sort of neutral-ish third party to kind of break that logjam or break that monopoly. The Supreme Court may, with Whitford, do something here, and there are at least a couple reasons why that I can offer. Again, I can't guarantee how it's going to come out, and I could see people saying they think it might come out the other way, but here are a couple reasons to at least hope that we might get something good here. First, the justices have long been concerned with getting mired in too many partisan gerrymandering disputes. If you sort of look at their opinions historically, one of the big concerns they raise is, well, districting happens all over the country. We don't just district for congressional maps or state legislative maps. We might even district just for one county's school board. So how do we know if we step in and say certain kinds of partisan advantaging are wrong, that we won't then have 1,000 cases that we have to hear every year? There are other things we have to do. We can't spend all our time doing this, and courts shouldn't be interfering in all of this activity in the states. The good news is, though, that extreme partisan gerrymandering is a relatively limited problem. Like I said, there are reasons to believe that it's only happened less than 20 times this past cycle. And if there are some limits on it going forward, hopefully it won't happen that much in the future. Second, and relatedly, these extreme gerrymanders are pretty easy to detect. So those maps I showed earlier, the way we generate, not myself, but my colleagues generated them, was they took 3 measures. One's called the efficiency gap, one is called the mean median difference, and another one is called partisan bias. What they did was they used each of those formulas to calculate the degree of what's called partisan asymmetry in the maps. Partisan asymmetry means that one party has an advantage vis-a-vis others in translating seats to votes. What that means is if a map is symmetrical, if either party gets X amount of votes, they get the same number of seats. So a symmetric map would say if Republicans get 51% of the average statewide vote, they get 60% of seats. And if Democrats get 51% of the average statewide vote, they get 60% of the seats. An asymmetric map is something like you have in Wisconsin. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's something like if Republicans get 51% of the seats, they get 51% of the vote, they get 67% of the seats. If Democrats get 51% of the votes, they get like 52% of the seats. It turns out that a lot of maps that fail under one measure will fail under them all, and that's a strong indication that a particular map is bad. Wisconsin is a map that fails under all of them. We also know that these extreme gerrymanders are more likely to occur under a certain set of conditions. So I referenced the battleground status. The first one is single party control, the redistricting process. And that either means that basically all the checks that are held in the process are held by the same party. So usually they're drawn by a legislature and the governor has veto. So single party control might be a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor. The reason why you need single party control to have an extreme gerrymander is that if the other party has some say in how the map turns out, they're not going to let it happen. So you can kind of use single party control as a way of narrowing down the number of maps that are probably even likely to pose the threat of being unconstitutional. And then you generally want to look at states that are competitive statewide, because it's really only when there's competition that there's even an incentive to really get in the lab and really try to start gaming the maps. If you have an overwhelming majority in a state, you don't really need to fool around with the maps all that much to maintain your power. Third, these extreme gerrymanders are clearly outside the bounds of what the Constitution permits. This is something that the plaintiffs argued in Whitford. It was also argued in extreme depth by many of the amici that filed friend of the court briefs. Happy to talk about that further. I'm glossing over it, although it's one of the more important parts of the case. Fourth, and relatedly, there's been a huge outpouring of support in terms of friend of the court briefs in favor of the plaintiffs. Obviously, it's not the whole game, but if you look at most of the topics that are discussed in this case, whether it's questions of how voters vote, what statistics do, kind of on down the line, the plaintiffs have amici who are respected experts in their fields, providing strong empirical data for what they're saying. The briefs on the other side don't have any of that. And to me, it suggests that the huge weight of good thinking in this space is on the side of doing something for the plaintiffs. The final thing is that there's a huge popular appetite for doing something about partisan gerrymandering. The court's always concerned with outpacing the public opinion on issues. It's not because they have to rule the way that the majority of people think, but they want to make sure that if they're doing something, particularly something they think is controversial, that the public's going to accept it. The issue with the court now, though, is that the court's really far behind the public. So a 2013 Harris poll showed that 74% of Republicans, 73% of Democrats, and 71% of independents say that those who stand to benefit from redrawing congressional districts should not have a say in how they're drawn. Now, the obvious question there, though, is, well, how do you know then that means that you want the courts to do something about it? So in September, a survey by Lake Research Partners and WPA Intelligence showed that a supermajority of those polled support the court, the Supreme Court, specifically stepping in to place limits on the practice. This number is an aggregate of all of the polling results, but the numbers don't really change in any significant way if you disaggregate them along party affiliation. All right, so that's litigation. Smaller pieces of this puzzle. One is ballot initiatives. So in about 24 states, there are ballot initiative procedures that allow people to introduce reforms even if they're not initiated by their legislators. California has a Citizens Redistricting Commission, which is generally regarded as the model now for how redistricting should be done by commissions. That was the result of two ballot initiatives, one that first put the state redistricting process under the control of the commission, and then a follow-up one that did the congressional maps. So now that California sort of has one map under its belt, other states are now trying to move to replicate that. And an example where this is happening is in Michigan. I was there 2 weeks ago visiting Ann Arbor and Detroit, and in a 36-hour period, I was approached 3 times to sign the petition for the initiative. I didn't sign because that's voter fraud of some kind, I guess, and that would be wrong. But that goes to show that people are really out there, they're energized, they're beating the sidewalks to really try to make something happen. Now, the other one, and this might be a little shocking to end on, but there's also the potential for legislative reform. Now, generally, we shouldn't really count on legislators doing anything about the problem because they benefit from the problem. You know, it's all sticks. There are no real carrots there. But there are some glimmers of hope. So this past weekend, I was in Pennsylvania speaking to a group called Fair Districts PA, which is basically a organized volunteer organization that's going out to help generate grassroots pressure in favor of legislative reform. There are 2 bills that are circulating right now that would create 11-person independent commissions, and there's tremendous energy around it. Now, this is one place to really keep an eye on depending on how Whitford goes. So if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs, the politicians who have benefited from there not being rules in the past may feel a little bit more incentive to actually go to the table and reform their processes, because they take a tremendous amount of time and money and energy, and if they can't get anything extra out of them, they might think that it's not worth the trouble anymore and they can just outsource it to other people. If Whitford ends up not going for the plaintiffs, then what we may also see in some states where there's some question about what party is going to be in control next decade, you could see both parties rushing to the table to try to put something on the table in terms of reform to make sure that they don't get exploited the way some of the minority parties in other states have been exploited in the past. So there are bills floating around in basically every state legislature from this past term. I wouldn't say that most of them have a good chance of passing, but it's a dynamic environment, and we may see some movement in there depending on how these other pieces fall.
What are the green states and what are the gray states?
The green states are states where there's currently some form of reform legislation pending. And the types of reforms kind of run the gamut. So there are a lot of different opinions about the way to reform these processes. Sometimes it involves just putting in firmer, clearer rules. Sometimes it involves creating a commission. There are many different ways of creating commissions, but there's something that we would characterize as reform legislation happening in basically every state at this point. We have a fairly long evening. I'll be available to talk further for questions and answers, but to the extent that you're interested in learning more about redistricting from the Brennan Center's perspective, we have an issues page dedicated to the subject. We also have a resource page that's devoted specifically to the Whitford case, which includes an annotated guide to the Whitford amicus briefs. There are over 1,000 pages worth of these things. We read them all so you don't have to. You can also follow the Brennan Center on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. My boss, Michael Lee, is on Twitter. He's much better at Twitter than I am. I would recommend following him in particular for all things redistricting. Thanks.
I'm about 1.5 feet shorter than Tom, so hopefully I'll be able to speak directly into the microphone. So first of all, thank you all for having me, and thank you all for coming out tonight for this discussion. As was alluded, I've got a long career working in voting. I've worked in the field of elections, voting, and democracy for about 2 decades now, having started with the Justice Department in the late 90s, worked there for many years on issues including gerrymandering. And then, since then, I went to work at Pew, and I led Pew's efforts in the election space for many years, and then I recently founded my own nonprofit where we're continuing to work in this space. I'm going to talk about something very different than gerrymandering. During my time working in the space of voting, I believed, and many of us in this space believed, that if we built it, they would come. And by that I mean, if we just made voting much, much easier, more people would come to vote. It actually was a central tenet of almost everything we worked on for so long. And over the course of that time, we were incredibly successful in doing that. We have made voting incredibly easy, registering to vote. There are now about 40 states where people can register to vote online. There are many states that belong to a data exchange called the Electronic Registration Information Center that I helped found that actually proactively goes out and tries to get people registered to vote and keeping their information up to date. People can get voting information on their smartphones. 40% of all voters in 2016 voted before Election Day. More voters vote by mail or early than ever before, and more voters have a choice about where they vote than ever before. We have been incredibly successful. And what's happened? Turnout is still going down. About 2 out of 5 eligible voters in any given presidential year or at any time never show up. The high water mark for turnout in this country is about 60%. We actually pegged close to 62% for Obama in 2008. That's the high water mark. That was the highest turnout in a presidential election since 1964. Turnout in 2016, for instance, amongst young people, and we've spent a lot of money to try to get young people to vote. 1 in 3 eligible 18-year-olds who had just turned 18 voted in 2016. 1 in 3. That's the lowest point at any point since 18-year-olds were given the right to vote in 1972. But presidential elections are not the problem. We actually know what we're going to get in presidential elections. In November of 2014, we saw the lowest turnout in any federal election since 1942, when most young American men were either overseas fighting or getting ready to go overseas to fight. We saw turnout of below 36% of eligible voters nationwide in November of 2014. And that is not the exception. That is the rule. This is the trend that is happening. And so what we are seeing over time, and by the way, that's still much better than what we're seeing in primaries and local races. Do you know how many states in the 2016 presidential primaries that resulted, for instance, in President Trump's nomination and also Secretary Clinton's nomination? You know how many states had over 50% turnout in their presidential primaries? No, 2 did. 2 did. 2 out of 50. One of them was New Hampshire, which has a population about the size of this room. So, I mean, this is an ongoing problem we have. I mean, I know it's not the people in this room. If you're here tonight, you're probably voting like I do. If there's a special election for dog catcher, I'm there. I'll figure it out. I'll get on my laptop and I'll figure out who the candidates are and I'll find some reason to vote for one of them. But most people, we're about 10% of the population. I'll give you another example. In March of 2017, literally 5 months after 60% of the public had gone to vote in the presidential election, Los Angeles, the second largest city in the United States, held a mayoral election. Turnout was about 12% for that election. So even assuming that they had all voted in November means about 1 in 5 of the people who voted in November bothered to show up for the LA City mayor's race. So we have been experiencing a crisis of democracy around us even before the November 2016 election hit. And what we're seeing in November 2016 and since then is incredibly disturbing. And it's disturbing for 2 reasons, maybe reasons that you don't even realize. And I want to talk about 2 narratives that are doing a lot to disturb the confidence of the voter, potentially depressing turnout, and potentially undermining the very foundation of our democracy in a way that we have never seen before. So the 2 narratives, the first one is the myth of widespread voter fraud. I think many of you will remember this tweet that happened in, is that the November tweet? I think it is, where President Trump alleged that he would have won the popular vote, but for the millions of people who voted illegally. Shortly thereafter, after his inauguration, he said he was going to start a massive investigation into voter fraud. Now, actually, he cited, I don't know if many of you remember this, when he was talking about his justification for these claims, he cited a Pew report saying there was fraud. I'm the guy that wrote that report. The report was not about fraud at all. The report was about how voter lists, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit later, how voter lists are inaccurate. There are inaccuracies with the voter list, largely because people move in between elections and election officials don't always have the data necessary to keep up with that mobility. So one of the challenges election officials face, and I'm not going to go into this to a great degree, but if someone moved in January of 2017, election officials are probably going to hear about it in September or October of 2020. Because that's when all the voter registration activity occurs, because people don't understand that they need to keep this up to date, and the systems aren't set up in most places to do that. But it had nothing to do with fraud whatsoever. I actually got very popular on social media and was on the news a lot during that time. It was both fun and awful at the same time. And so that eventually led to the establishment of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, a supposedly bipartisan commission. It is the first bipartisan commission I've ever seen that has both the chair and vice chair of the same party, and an incredible disparity between the parties and who is participating. Unfortunately, I put Mr. Dunn's name in red there. Sadly, he tragically passed away just this past week. So now there is actually even a greater disparity amongst parties. 7-4 between Republicans and Democrats. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that either, except you guys have read all of this in the news about what's going on with this supposed voter fraud commission and what they're supposedly looking at and how they're spending taxpayer money to answer a question we already know the answer to, which I'm going to tell you about in just a second. So this has led to a variety of headlines and news reports that you've seen. Trump voter fraud panel may spark partisan voting rights battle. Presidential Commission demands massive amounts of state voter data. Backlash at Trump Commission request for confidential voter data. 54 states and D.C. have refused to give certain voter information to Trump Commission. Trump Voter Fraud Commission halts data collection amid torrents of lawsuits and complaints. And then this just came out this week. ProPublica reported, and several others reported, one of the staffers they had been arrested for having child pornography. That's not actually the real story. What's the real story here is that repeatedly people in the media and other advocates have asked the commission to be transparent about their efforts. Who is working for you? Can you tell us? Because if you're looking at data, how are you going to look at this data? What are the people's qualifications to look at this data, et cetera? And they repeatedly refuse to answer in any way. The only reason we know this guy was working for the commission is by the sheer accident that he happened to get arrested. It could have been for a DUI, it could have been for anything, but it was an accident that was found out about, which demonstrates one of the problems that we have here. So let me just, okay, yes, so that's the voter fraud problem. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a second, but I want to talk about the second narrative right now, which is a misunderstanding of the cyber threat to elections. And what's challenging about these two narratives, and you'll probably see this, we usually think about the voter fraud narrative coming from the right, but a lot of the cyber threat narrative is coming from the left. And this is where there are the challenges that we're seeing span the political spectrum. So you have seen headlines along these lines. Top secret NSA report details Russian hacking effort days before the 2016 election. Russian cyber hacks on U.S. electoral system far wider than previously known. Will the Georgia special election get hacked? Elections officials outgunned in Russia's cyber war against America. Hackers at DEF CON conference exploit vulnerabilities in voting machines. Hacking the vote, why voting systems aren't as secure as you might think. Hack vulnerable voting machines, a national security threat, experts warn. That was very recent, that was just last week. So I want to talk a little bit first about the hacking narrative and about the cyber threats that are out there, because there are there's a lot of confusion about the actual facts, and I think it's important to get this right. Now, the first fact is the threat is real. No one's saying that the threat isn't real. Russia is attempting to influence our elections, and one of the ways they're doing that, in addition to the social media and fake news that they've been doing, and that's absolutely established, is they have been attempting intrusions into some of the election systems. However, there are only 2 confirmed attempted hacks of an actual election system, with only 1 successful. Those were both attempted hacks of voter registration databases that are held at the statewide level. The first one, the unsuccessful one, was in Arizona. The FBI detected that a login credential used by one of the local election officials was being sold on the dark web. Before that could ever be used to access the system, the FBI notified the state of Arizona. The state of Arizona shut down all access to their system immediately. It was completely unsuccessful. No one ever got access to any Arizona voter registration data. But the one that was successful was Illinois. In late June of 2016, IP addresses associated with Russia started accessing data from the Illinois statewide voter registration database. And they did it very slowly. They were just collecting a few records at a time. And it didn't trigger any warnings. It didn't hit any threshold where they would notice it. Their bandwidth wasn't changed in any way. And this happened for about 2+ weeks where they didn't notice it. And then about mid-July, all of a sudden Russia turned up the volume and they started accessing about 10 records a second. And this caught the attention of Illinois officials. And they noticed it right away. And they shut down access. And by the way, this is all from testimony from June's hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee. The director of this Illinois State Board of Elections was testifying. So an important thing about this is no data was changed. They confirmed that. No data was deleted. This was just an access of records. Now, why would a foreign power slowly be accessing records and then all of a sudden in the middle of July turn the volume way up, which was sure to get noticed? And why would they do this in the state of Illinois, which honestly, I don't know how much Hillary won that by, but she won it by double digits, and it wasn't going to be close. What was happening in mid-July? The conventions were about to start. And in fact, President Trump's first tweet about rigging happened on August 4th. Okay? Now, I don't have any information that indicates there's a connection between those two, by any means. But Russia wasn't trying to change that information, and most security experts and intelligence experts agree on that. What were they trying to do? They wanted to be noticed. They wanted us to worry about what was happening with our election technology, and they wanted to do it at a point in time when it was going to get the most notice and get the most play. There's been reports that 21 states were scanned. These two were part of the 21 states. That's true, by Russia. But I'll also tell you this, all 50 states were almost certainly scanned. And in fact, if you work with any databases anywhere, it's almost certain that your databases are being scanned. That happens all the time. There are bots that are set up to do this. Scanning is not a hack. Scanning is not a penetration. It is just what normally happens in our environment. What a lot of folks in the tech world will call it is rattling doorknobs. They're rattling doorknobs to see which ones are locked or unlocked. If something's locked, they'll move on to the next doorknob. So that's happening in all the states, but only 2 states saw any kind of breach in any way or attempted breach. But, and this is very important, the voter registration systems are different than the voting systems themselves and the tabulation systems that go along with those voting systems. And there remains to this day, almost a year after the election, zero evidence that there was any hacking of the vote totals themselves. This is despite repeated investigations. There is a narrative out there that says that no one has looked for this. That is absolutely false, and I'll give you an example. In June, these 2 professors at the University of Michigan, one a computer science professor, one a political science professor, looked at all of the ballots and ballot images from Michigan and Wisconsin. Why did they have those ballot images available? Because there were statewide recounts in Michigan and Wisconsin. So they actually had access to all of the ballots, and they looked at Michigan and Wisconsin. And by the way, very importantly, 2 of the 3 states without which President Trump wouldn't have won the election, and 2 of the 3 states that Secretary Clinton would have needed to win the election instead. And this was their conclusion. Our analysis offers evidence that the voting technology did not distort the votes in Wisconsin or Michigan. How a vote was treated appears not to have depended on which candidate the vote was for. If there was a hack, it appears not to have changed the results. There are very, very rarely investigations of this caliber that happen after an election. This is something in an independent investigation of ballots demonstrated in 2 of the 3 states that were absolutely essential to the election. And I think many people don't realize, we hear, and especially for you here in New Jersey, where you do have voting technology that does not utilize a paper trail or an auditable record in some way, at least some places within New Jersey. There are more places in the United States today that have paper ballots than at any point in time since the computer age began. especially non-punch card paper ballots. The punch cards, we got rid of those after the 2000 election. So 75% of all people in the United States vote on paper now. That's more than ever before. And over half the states require audits of that paper as a matter of course. So we actually have more security in that way than we ever have before. Is it enough? No. I'll talk about that again. But it's better than it ever has been. And very importantly, the states that are entirely paper include Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, Colorado. I could go on. There's a lot of those states that have paper. So we're talking about battleground states that have entirely paper throughout the entire state. All right, so now let me move back to the voter fraud issue because I want to talk a little bit about that as well. If you ask, and we've done studies of this, if you ask people in the country if they believe that voter fraud is a problem, you get vast majorities saying yes. You get vast majorities of Democrats saying yes. You get vast majorities of minority Democrats saying yes. The narrative has gone out of control, and people are very, very worried about voter fraud. The problem is that most people, when they think of voter fraud, they're thinking of not a very specific thing, but a very, very broad kind of nebulous force that's operating against elections. And that's why one of the challenges we face in elections is, for most people out there, when you say voter fraud or vote suppression or dark money or hacking, those all fall into the same nebulous concern for people. And some of those things are coming from the left, and some of those things are coming from the right. But it is all operating to suppress voters' confidence in the system and diminish that confidence in the system. So a lot of people think about voter fraud, but they don't necessarily, if you ask them, what do you mean by voter fraud, they start talking about all kinds of different things that don't necessarily equate to the same thing. But when we're talking about voter fraud in this context, what I'm talking about is people illegally casting ballots they should not be able to cast. Either they're ineligible to vote and they shouldn't be voting, or they're eligible to vote but they're voting and they're voting more than once. Here's what's been found. The states routinely do investigations of this. It's often a narrative amongst those who want to make you think that voter fraud exists, that we just don't know. No one really knows, and no one ever looks for it. But the fact is, these states, and I should just mention that of these 4 states, 3 of them, the bottom 3, are run predominantly by Republicans. North Carolina has a board of elections. Ohio and Tennessee has a Republican Secretary of State. California has a Democratic Secretary of State. And this is the results of their investigations in 2016 and the number of voter fraud cases they found. And you'll see the numbers, kind of hover right around 0.001%. That's a number we see repeatedly when we look at this kind of, when we look at the investigations. But it's not just the states who have done this. The George W. Bush Justice Department, partially during the time when I was there, started a huge investigation to try to demonstrate widespread voter fraud. And they found literally a couple of dozen cases out of hundreds of millions of votes cast. Similarly, academics have looked at this and found a few dozen cases out of hundreds of millions of votes cast. Even the Conservative Heritage Foundation, which is one of the organizations trying to push the myth of voter fraud, likes to trumpet the fact that they have found 1,000 cases of voter fraud. Those date back to 1948. There are literally billions of votes that have been cast during that period of time. For any of you that have run a business in your life, if someone came to you and said, I can guarantee that we'll have a fraud percentage in your business of 0.001%. How fast would you sign on the dotted line for that? Banks usually incorporate about a 2% fraud rate because they make enough money that they can absorb that, and it would cost too much to try to get that down further. This is a remarkably low rate. Voter fraud exists. It's not zero, but it's not much more than zero. It's very, very small in the United States. I think that actually says something really good about Americans and how seriously they take their right to vote and their responsibility to vote. So what have these 2 narratives contributed to, and given the crisis state that we were probably already in prior to November 2016? Well, this is a poll that was taken in late June of 2017. And the question was asked, how much do you trust that elections are fair? This poll was done by NPR. And if you look overall, 47% of the United States says they don't trust that their elections are fair at all or very much. Nearly half of all voters have very little trust that elections are fair. Now, Republicans have a little more trust. That is normal. We have seen in the past, if you ask people about confidence in the election system after an election, the winning party always has more confidence than the losing party. Overall confidence in the elections in 2004 and 2008 were exactly the same, except if you divided them by party, they were flipped. And so overall, you see these numbers. But we don't see numbers like this 8 months after an election. That's incredibly rare. These are very, very low numbers. Independents, roughly 50%. Democrats, over 50%, of course. I don't know what these numbers mean yet. We've never seen this before. And it's something that concerns me a great deal, and we're going to have to see how this plays out over time. But the narratives we're seeing are coming again from both sides, and I want to stress that. Here are narratives that mostly come from the left. WikiLeaks proves primary was rigged. DNC undermined democracy. Sanders supporters walk off convention floor, blame rigged system for his loss. And then from the right, almost half of Republicans say Trump won the popular vote. 47% of Republicans, which I don't think I need to tell you he did not win the popular vote. He lost by over 3 million. And then this was a fairly recent polling conclusion that happened in August. In a new poll, half of Republicans say would support postponing the 2020 election if Trump proposed. I feel fairly confident. I know sometimes, and Tom is probably in the same boat, we don't like to talk about what the Supreme Court would do for sure, or what we know. I feel fairly confident the Supreme Court would not go along with that. But you know, this is a remarkable expression of the state of mind of the American voter. I call it the fragile psyche of the American voter right now. And I bet a lot of us in this room actually feel somewhat fragile as voters in the current environment.
That was two-thirds of Republican
Right.
voters.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that is not normal, and I think it could have short and long-term effects on voter confidence and participation. So that was all the depressing stuff. I'm going to offer a few recommendations that I use in this space, especially when talking with election officials and policymakers and the media. First, and this is very, very important, rededicate ourselves to relying solely on facts and evidence. There are a lot of things that we wish dearly to be true, that would feel so good if they were true. There are a lot of people who really want to delegitimize President Trump however they possibly can. But here is the fact. President Trump won a majority of the vote in enough states to comprise a majority of the Electoral College. And that is actually true. And so there might be other ways and reasons to delegitimize President Trump if you oppose President Trump, but that is not one of them, because there still remains, after nearly a year, not the tiniest bit of evidence that even one vote was switched in any single jurisdiction in the country. This is something I often talk to folks about. Election officials are not the problem, they are part of the solution. If you know your election official, if you don't know your election official, find them and give that poor person a hug. I mean, these are people, there is never a headline on the day after Election Day, everything went great. How many people remember the name Teresa Lepore? Anyone? Oh, usually I get more than that. Teresa Lepore was the Palm Beach County, Florida Supervisor of Elections in 2000. Okay? I bet some of you kind of half remembered that, but couldn't remember where you thought of it. You know why we know the name of the Teresa Lepore? Because things went horribly wrong in 2000 in Palm Beach County, Florida. But you can't name any other Florida election official. And well, yeah, and she's gone too. Something went wrong with her as well. So they never get recognized when things go right. We expect things to go right, as we should. But when things go wrong, they're noticed right away. But I can tell you, talking with election officials all over the country, they are focused on this problem. They are focused on the problem of the cyber threats. They are focused on the problem of increasing voter confidence and trying to get more people to turn out to vote. So they are on this, and they're working hard to do it. Some are doing a better job than others, but still, most of them, to the large part, are doing a great job here. There is a real opportunity for bipartisanship here, and I think we're squandering it in some ways. Talking to a lot of election officials and others around the country, there is broad consensus that something is not right. And it's not just about policy. There's kind of a concern about the state of our democracy overall. And this is shared between liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. They know it. And I hope that we find ways to bridge those gaps and find ways to work together, because I think there really are some great opportunities for bipartisanship here. I mentioned this before. We have to recognize that inaccurate voter lists are part of the problem, and it's driving some of the concern about voter fraud. There have been efforts in the voter registration space, an area that I know very, very well. It has generally been that the left just wants more people on the list, or perceived that way, and the right just wants fewer people on the list, or perceived that way. That's an oversimplification, but in some cases it's been somewhat true. I will tell you that the serious thinkers in this space think both are out of it. That we need to have every eligible voter who wants to be on the list, but only eligible voters on the list. And if someone has moved away or died, we should have a good way of removing them, as long as we make sure we don't accidentally get the wrong people off. But because we have let the voter rolls bloat in some cases and not done good list maintenance on them, this is driving some of the narrative that the voter fraud folks are using to propel the idea that there is widespread voter fraud. Now, one of the things I often have to explain is an inaccurate, out-of-date record on the voter list. To get from there to a fraudulent vote cast, you have to jump over the Grand Canyon to get to there. There is a huge chasm between those two things with a whole bunch of checks and balances. It is very, very hard to cast an illegal vote. And your big payoff, if you're successful, is you have risked multiple years in prison and thousands of dollars of fine for the big payoff of one additional vote cast in an election in which 140 million have been cast. It's one of the reasons we see voter fraud so rarely. But we do have to recognize that we should be using tools to clean those voter lists up. We have to acknowledge that this threat is real and it's not going away. Russia's not going to stop tomorrow, and Russia's not the only one doing it. We know North Korea is doing it. We know Iran has tried. There are other actors, state actors, and lone individuals who are going to try to do things to mess with American democracy. Technology is not going away. We're not going to start voting on stone tablets chiseled with a hammer. We're going to be using technology. There is literally no way we can even hand count all the paper ballots in America in time to get the results fast enough. If you're Los Angeles County, California, which has about 6 million voters, hand counting those ballots would take a very, very long time. So we're going to be using technology. We need to have a way of using it effectively. That means stronger audits of process and ballots will be necessary. States that don't already have audits will need to implement audits. States that already have audits might need to implement stronger audits. We need to have a way to transparently demonstrate to the American people that when they cast their ballots, that those ballots are going to be correctly counted. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no such thing as a mistake-free election. I mean, you've probably seen mistakes at your own polling places. Those things happen. Imagine any other event where 140 million Americans do the same thing at essentially the same time. There's going to be some things that go wrong. But we need to know that we got the right outcomes in all cases, and that requires better audits. And reviewing security protocols and training. So, for instance, one of the attacks that occurred was an attempted spear phishing of a voter registration systems vendor. There's some dispute as to whether or not that spear phishing was successful, whether one of the employees clicked on the link and by doing so gave access to the machine to a foreign party, we believe from Russia. But regardless, there needs to be better training. There needs to be better security protocols. So, for instance, do people know what two-factor or multi-factor authentication is? Some people know that. Okay, so basically what this is if any change of password or anything happens, before they put that into effect, they contact you through another device to confirm that you are the person who indeed did that. And that can be a very effective tool to prevent any kind of hack of login credentials. And there needs to be more of that in elections. One of the things you might have heard is that there is some tension between the federal government, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, and election officials in the state. And one of the reasons is that Department of Homeland Security had a lot of information that it was seeing from the intelligence community about potential threats but they were not sharing it with the people who actually could do something about those potential threats, the election officials in the states. We are now seeing a big change. This is actually a very good thing that's happening. Just this past weekend, what was called a coordinating council was convened of federal agencies, several state and local election officials from all over the country to facilitate better communication in the case of a threat. Or so, for instance, a state won't know if a foreign government if they're seeing activity from a foreign government that's directed at the United States or at a particular state. But on the other hand, the feds won't know how to fix it if that's happening. They need to have communication between the two to assess the threat and then mitigate the risk. Does everyone know what the Election Assistance Commission is? Election Assistance Commission is a federal agency established a little more than a decade ago in the wake of the Florida election in 2000 to assist states in many ways, provide a clearinghouse for information and best practices, and they also certify election technology for use in almost all of the states. And the Republican Party in the House has tried to get rid of the Election Assistance Commission for a long time. It's a very, very expensive entity. It costs a whole $8 million a year. I think that's even less than the 0.001% that I mentioned for fraud in the federal budget. But they do amazing work, and they've actually been the liaison between the election officials and the federal government in a lot of this work. So if you ever hear about the Election Assistance Commission, support it. It's a very important thing. Reinvest in election infrastructure. This might be particularly important in New Jersey, where you might need new technology to be able to achieve some of the goals of auditable, transparent, secure elections. And that will cost money. These things are not free. And this is probably not a spoiler. Money's probably not coming from the federal government. So that might mean that the state legislatures are going to have to act. So with that, that's my information, including my Twitter handle and my organization's Twitter handle and website, which I welcome you to all go on. And I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
That was pretty good, wasn't it? Thank you. We're going to take a little minute. We're going to do a new format for our questioning. We used to have you line up for it, but now we're going to have people coming to you with the microphones to make it a lot easier. So if you have questions, just raise your hand, and we'll direct the person with the microphone over to you. You heard me, didn't you? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yes, for the first speaker. You talked frequently about extreme gerrymandering. Well, I know that gerrymandering was an invented word. And what's normal gerrymandering? Is it is a process that we want to I guess it's done at the state level. What would make gerrymandering a healthy process?
Is this microphone? I'm not sure if this is working. I think it is. Is it? Yeah. Folks can hear me? Okay, great. Right, so what the extreme gerrymandering tag is, it's doing a couple different things. The first thing it's doing is it's trying to mark out one particular kind of unfair redistricting. So, one party locking in control. You also have these kind of like incumbent protection rackets, what we'd call a bipartisan gerrymander, where you have two parties basically agreeing between themselves how to cut up the map. This is sort of the crux of the issue with Supreme Court, particularly when you're talking about creating maps that are fair. What does it mean to have a map that's fair? And we have a lot of different ways of trying to cut to that. And at a certain level, it's an unanswerable question, because the thing that makes redistricting so difficult, and one of the reasons why people talk about it being a political question, is because what we want is our maps to reflect something about our values as like a pluralistic democracy. So your ideal map is going to have communities of interest represented, but you can define a community of interest in any number of different ways. It could be a racial or ethnic group. It could be people that all travel to work on using the same public transport. It may be people that send their kids to the same schools. It can be cut up in any number of different ways. You also want to have maps that are fair under any number of other dimensions. Now, what we're getting at in attacks on extreme partisan gerrymandering is the notion that the map shouldn't unfairly benefit one party versus the other. This is this concept of symmetry. So the idea is that the same amount of votes get you the same amount of seats. That doesn't mean that we're asking for a proportional representation or anything like that. It just means that if one party turns out voters the same way the other party turns out voters, then they should each enjoy the same share of seats. That's sort of like one narrow way of tackling the problem. What people can do if they want to be more ambitious about this is sort of specify either through legislation or the kinds of policies that will govern redistricting commissions, the types of things that we care about. So sometimes people answer the question in procedural terms, and they would say, a fair map is a map that comes out of a fair process. And a fair process is one where all of the folks that have an interest in the map are represented in the creation of the map, and that the map is approved in some way that doesn't rely or allow one interest group to determine the map that represents everyone. I realize that's a very abstract answer to that question, but yeah, it's complicated.
You've said that you don't think there are very many cases of voter fraud. I am not, big on the idea that there's a lot of it, but fraud, by definition, if it's successful, is undetectable. I mean, just what kind of evidence do we have that there hasn't been some voter fraud which we haven't detected? I mean, like people voting in the place of people who they know are not going to bother to vote, people who are dead, and so on.
First of all, I've never heard that definition, that fraud by definition has to be undetectable. Fraud is often detected and it's prosecuted. We wouldn't have need for fraud laws if it was always undetectable. But successful fraud also happens that is detected many years later. But what's different in the voting space is a very big difference. You have to be registered to vote before you can even attempt an act. You don't have to be registered for any other activity, on most other activities, before you do that. That means you've given them your name, your information, that enables you to cast a ballot in the first place. So, for instance, in the case of voter impersonation fraud, which happens almost not at all, you will have actually, and I say this as a former federal prosecutor, had to have shown up and presented yourself and said you were someone else. What could happen in that case? Well, best case scenario, you've got a lot of physical evidence. You've got stuff the person has touched. You've got a signature on a register. You've got eyewitnesses to who that person is. I would love that as a federal prosecutor. But even more important, you have to really hope that the person you're impersonating doesn't show up to vote after that. So this is why we would have detected voter fraud. In the case of dead voters, there are death lists that every state matches to their voter lists all the time. The Electronic Registration Information Center that I mentioned before, or ERIC as we call it for short, which has 20 states plus DC in it, and includes some of the battleground states like Virginia, Ohio, Colorado, Nevada, et cetera. They check death data against the voter list consistently, constantly. They found 200,000 dead people on the list. You know how many people they found of those that have voted? Hardly any. The number actually might be zero from what I know. There are actually a variety of checks and balances, and I know it's a talking point that fraud just can't be detected, so we can't know it's the case. Because of voter registration lists, it's actually not very hard to detect it in the case of voting.
Question for David. Am I up? Yeah. I'm interested what you think about the interstate cross-check program that reportedly deletes a number of eligible voters from the voter rolls in about 20 or 30 states.
So for those of you who don't know, Interstate Crosscheck is a program that was started back in around 2007 or 2008 by the Secretary of State of Kansas. It is not the current Secretary of State of Kansas that started it. It was a previous Secretary of State of Kansas that started it. And it's a way of trying to look at the voter list and determine if anyone might have voted in multiple states after the election. They collect data from a variety of states. Every January or so, they match it together, and they send back to the states a list of people who potentially double voted. One of the problems they have, and we could talk about this all night, and I promise not to, is that if you take information on a voter list and match it to information on a voter list, you get a huge number of false positives. An example I'll use, just because it happens to be handy, is the name John Kelly. Some of you might know people named John Kelly, including someone who's sitting in the White House with President Trump. There are over 5,000, actually that's probably a pretty significant undercount, but I know for a fact that there's at least over 5,000 John Kellys in the United States. And of those, the vast majority share a date of birth with another John Kelly. Not a day of birth, not January 1st, a date of birth, January 1st, 1950. That is very, very hard then to say, we know that this is the same John Kelly or these are two different John Kellys. And as I say, crosscheck has a big problem that most of the states who participate in crosscheck will tell you, which is that they deliver a huge number of false positives. It's been one study determined that there were 200 false positive matches for every one actual match that crosscheck delivers. But one thing that's important about crosscheck does not delete names from the list. States have the power to delete names from the list, only consistent with the National Voter Registration Act. Crosscheck is a resource that goes to the states, but what the states will tell you is they get this huge haystack of names, and they have to decide, do we want to sift through that or not to find the needle in that haystack? I will use the worst analogy that I've ever come up with in my entire life, which is the difference between crosscheck and ERIC is that crosscheck gives you a haystack and asks you to find the needle, and ERIC gives you a pile of needles. Come on, that's a bad analogy. That's awful. So crosscheck, I think what we're going to see is as the data quality of other tools like ERIC gets better and better and better, crosscheck's not really a problem because states are finding it's not really useful to them. It's not actionable data. It requires so much effort on the back end to actually sift through that to find any data that they can act on. But the data quality is not particularly high.
If I could follow up. Greg Palast has sold a lot of books and films contending that crosscheck has actually deleted thousands and thousands of eligible voters from the rolls and prevented them from voting.
Yeah, I know he has. I don't have any. I mean, I can just tell you that generally what happens, just because a report from crosscheck has thousands of voters on it, does not mean that a state is removing those voters from the list. There are a lot of really good advocacy organizations, including Brennan Center, who are constantly monitoring states to see what the so-called purges are. And where there are purges of voters, there are lawsuits brought. This is just because crosscheck reports a voter as a potential double voter, that does not mean that voter is being removed by the state. There is a big gap in between those two things, and most states try to do the responsible effort of figuring out whether it's actionable data or not that they can remove the voter.
This question is for Tom. Could you give us a quick overview of what the districting situation is in New Jersey, what the structure is, and whether there are any changes actively being discussed at this time or what you foresee in the future?
Sure, I can speak to how the process has worked previously in recent redistricting cycles and how it's set to be for the time being. So in New Jersey, you have a commission structure. One commission handles the state legislative maps, and the other commission handles the congressional maps. The congressional commission is a little larger than the one that handles the state maps, but basically what they both are what we call politician commissions. So what they have are folks that are appointed and function as a delegation of the Democratic, in these recent redistricting cycles, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And then there's, in both systems, although the structures are slightly different, there's always an odd number tiebreaker vote. And the idea is basically that these two groups come together as part of one body, and they draw the maps, and then the maps have to be approved by a majority of the commission. Then they're put into place. The last cycle, one of the maps was challenged on a variety of state and federal legal grounds, and the challenge was rejected. This isn't a model. This model is, to the best of my knowledge, will continue to be the model in New Jersey for the time being. It's not the kind of model that folks are generally looking towards now when they're talking about creating their commissions where commissions don't currently exist. So in California, for instance, there's a designated block of independent or unaffiliated citizens that serve on the commission. That's also the idea in Pennsylvania. And in order for the maps to be approved, you need to get approval not just of some Ds or some Rs. You have to get some Ds, some Rs, and some independent or unaffiliated voters. And the idea there is that both because of the way the maps are approved and the way the commissions are constituted, which is through a sort of it's essentially like an open hiring process where anyone who's a citizen of California can put in an application, that you get a body that is more independent of the political process and also represents more voices than just party voices.
This is really a related issue that was brought up when Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, called it sociological gobbledygook when he was, referring to the lawsuit. And my concern here is I think it's not sociology, it's statistics that he's having trouble with.
Right.
And I know that the amicus briefs are supposed to be the way that judges learn what they're supposed to learn, but the truth is they have to still understand the validity of the briefs and understand them. And, I was in software, and I can tell you that the number of really terrible decisions about IP issues relating to software are just, too numerous to mention. So, I guess what I'm asking is there any movement to try and just change the way that judges, deal with technical issues that they're not competent to judge? It's especially true with the Supreme Court when you know that they still send each other, handwritten notes and are really about as computer unsavvy as about any group that has such great weight in this country.
Sure. That's a great question, and there are a bunch of different issues that are kind of bundled up in there, so I'll try to pull them apart and take them one by one. For those folks who aren't familiar, Chief Justice Roberts was definitely an outspoken voice at the oral arguments in Whitford earlier in the month, and one of the things that he said was, it sort of seems to me that a lot of what you're talking about in terms of your evidence in this case is just a bunch of sociological gobbledygook, and what he was referring to there were those partisan symmetry measures that I've referenced a few times. As far as Whitford is concerned, the thing that makes Whitford an interesting case and probably the best case, one of the best cases you could have if you were really trying to finally get the court to say for the first time in decades that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional and that map is unconstitutional, is that all of those measures say that Wisconsin's map is bad. And even the results of those measures weren't challenged by the state's defense experts at trial. And so it's a somewhat easy case in the sense that the justices don't really need to know why the efficiency gap may be different than the mean median difference and may be different from partisan bias, because in this case, and in the case of several other maps, some of which are already being challenged, like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, any of the numbers you run on them are going to tell you they're bad. And so the real challenge is going to be down the road when people try to bring challenges to other states that aren't uniformly bad under these measures, and then the courts are going to have to figure out what to do, but I'm hoping that won't be for 5 to 10 years. The second point is that to the extent that the court's expressing some concern about its ability to use statistics, or however they want to characterize it, courts actually, including the Supreme Court, routinely use advanced social science to resolve any number of different kinds of issues. For instance, in the election law space, we have a concept of racially polarized voting, and that's something that came out of the context of Voting Rights Act Section 2 litigation. Congress, when it wrote that statute, didn't put racially polarized voting in the statute. That's something the court made up, and then courts had to figure out how to measure it. And they do it all the time. They do it in antitrust cases. And it's not just the highly eminent justices of the Supreme Court. It's also trial court judges all around the country in both the federal and the state courts. They know how to use statistics, and we have processes that have existed for a really long time to get expert evidence in front of the courts. So some of the expression there I don't think is actually like a genuine representation of the way the courts actually do function. There are other things going on in Whitford that, because of the complexity of the political question here, I think folks are looking for different ways to sort of exit the dispute. And one way of doing that is to say, well, quantitatively, we can't find an answer. That's just a surmise of mine. We also know that experts exist. They were used in trial here. They were used elsewhere to help judges make sense of what they're seeing. We also know that there have been offers from the American Sociological Association and other folks to caucus with the judges in private if that would be helpful. I don't know if we're going to see too much of that. But this is it's an ongoing issue, and it's actually something that's sort of like a little bit of a maybe a little known fact. If you read a lot of Supreme Court opinions, there are representations of fact in there that are really not based on anything. They're judges' and justices' assumptions about the way the world works. And so, this is a repeated issue we deal with. I'm hoping that in the case of Whitford, because you'll see a very large number of briefs that were written by the absolute experts in the field on political science, social science, that the justices will at least have the confidence that in this case we're talking about an easy case, and then district courts can go to work.
Well, wasn't there just a recent study that came out about the level of inaccuracy in the facts that were stated?
Yes. Yeah, you're referring to that ProPublica report from a couple days ago. Yeah, I mean, that report, so a report came out a few days ago, and it noted how there are several prominent Supreme Court cases in the last 10 to 20 years that seem as if the ruling pivoted on an understanding of fact that ended up being false. And the grim thing actually about that report is they only highlighted, I think, 5 or 6 cases, but...
They took a sample.
Right.
They couldn't really look at everything.
Right, exactly. They didn't look at all opinions, but it's really not uncommon for the justices at some point to have to make assumptions about the way the world works. Yep.
Tom, I think this is for you. You made a comment in your remarks a little bit about the Constitution and the 14th Amendment. Our newest justice apparently was commenting that he wasn't sure that gerrymandering was covered at all in the Constitution, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg said one person, one vote, maybe.
Right.
So what is the issue around the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and gerrymandering?
Sure. So the basic idea is that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prevents the government from treating similarly situated parties differently unless they have a good reason for doing so. I mean, that's sort of a slangy representation of what's going on, but the idea is once you invoke the concept of partisan symmetry, what you're saying is governmental actors, in this case the legislature that drew the maps, created a map that basically gives one party a bonus when it comes to converting their votes to seats, and they took away that same bonus or prevented the other party from having that same bonus. So you're treating two groups differently, members of two political parties differently, because they are members of different political parties. Typically what's then said, though, is that political parties aren't protected classes under the Equal Protection Clause, so what do you do there? And the answer to that is, even if you're treating two parties differently, you have to have at least a rational basis for doing it. And this is something that Justice Sotomayor got to at the oral argument in Whitford, where there was also the exchange that you mentioned with Justice Ginsburg. The government has to have a public-facing reason that's beneficial to the people for treating the two parties differently, and there is no justification for entrenching one party in power for 10 years. There just isn't. No one was able to offer one because there isn't one.
Hello, this is for David. It's a very basic question about voter registration. What sort of certification does a person who, sorry. What sort of certification does a person who is just registering for the first time need? And if a lot of this is done on the internet, how can you be sure
that whatever they present to you is in fact true?
Okay, so first of all, that's my Aunt Nina. Everyone say hi to Aunt Nina. So it's a good question. So the way that voter registration works under federal law now. So first of all, the general answer to almost every election question is it depends on which state you're in. But there is a federal law that applies to voter registration. And it says that if you're registering to vote for the very first time and you're not doing so in person before an election official, you need to give them either your driver's license number or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. That is then checked against either the motor vehicles or Social Security database to confirm that the information matches. If you don't provide either one of those, and there are some reasons that a small number of people might not have at least even a Social Security number, or not know it at least if they can give it, that doesn't mean you're out of luck. And it also doesn't mean you're out of luck if for some reason the information doesn't match. It just means that when you show up to vote, you have to show one of about 18 forms of ID. So there are checks. You have to show something that proves you are who you are, and what they're trying to balance, as you can imagine, is they want to give enough information to provide integrity to the process, while at the same time not providing a disincentive for someone who might not have easy access to some of that identification that you might otherwise need. And I think it hits that balance. Now, online voter registration is interesting. The way it works in almost every state is in order to register online in most states, you need to have a record in the motor vehicles database. Anyone want to venture a guess as to why that is? To torture you, yeah, that might be. It's actually not for the reason, most people will guess that it's because, so you can check the information in the motor vehicles database. And of course, that's what they do. But that's not actually the main reason. The main reason is every voter registration record in almost every state, not every state, but almost every state, needs to have a signature associated with it. And if you're doing it online, it's very hard to get a signature, but DMV has your signature because you went into a DMV when you were there, so they import the signature from there. But in order to access your who in the room has used an online voter registration site? Anyone? Wow, okay. So usually when you access an online voter registration site, you have to give several pieces of personal information that hopefully only you would have. So I just received an email from someone down in Florida. Florida just went live with online voter registration a couple weeks ago, actually less than 2 weeks ago. And in order to log into that site, you need to have a driver's license number, last 4 of social, and the issue date on your license. One of the nice things about that is theoretically, even like with Equifax and everything, you might be able to get the first 2, but you need to have that physical license in your hand to get the issue date. So that's actually a pretty good practice. You also have to obviously have your name. So in order to access a record and to initiate a record that can be checked against the motor vehicles database, you have to give several pieces of personal information that theoretically only you would have, so you've confirmed identity. Yeah. So 2 very different questions there. One, you of course have to be a citizen in order to register to vote and vote. But in every online voter registration system I have seen, and I think I've seen all of them, in some cases that's true, in some cases that's not true. In Oregon, you can't get a driver's license, or in Arizona without a proof of citizenship. In some other states, they never ask for any documentation that could possibly be citizen. Most states fall somewhere in between. However, there's 2 things that happen. What you're seeing on the front end of your online voter registration site is not the whole process that's going on. But on that front end, most sites require you to check various boxes to say that you're eligible to vote. And citizenship's only one of them. It's also that you're a resident of the state that you say you're in, that you're over the age of 18 or older. And in states where felons are disenfranchised, and in some states they aren't. In Vermont, you can vote from jail. You'll have to check a box that says, I have not been disenfranchised by virtue of a felony. Now, so you have to check all of those boxes, and even then, most states then check and make sure you haven't given them some documentation that seems to cast doubt on that, and they might call you and confirm. But here is one thing that's absolutely sure. One of the dumbest things that any non-citizen could do is register to vote, and it happens. It does happen. In almost every single one of those cases, it's confusion. They don't understand, or there's a language issue, or they've been given a form and they think they're supposed to do it at the DMV. Because if you're a non-citizen that has documented non-citizenship at DMV, you are probably legally present here in the United States, and you're probably hoping at some point to establish yourself as a citizen and get permanent resident status. Registering to vote will get you deported. So these are all people who are doing it by accident, and usually the process has failed them. It's not the voters who have done something wrong themselves. So it does happen. The states are, and I don't mean to suggest it's a perfect situation in every state. There's a story out of Pennsylvania where some people who are not citizens were accidentally registered. So the states are still working that out, and I think it's incumbent upon the states and those of us who work with them to try to get a better process so those people aren't accidentally directed to registering to vote out of confusion.
I guess I've moved from that side to this side. We were just told that there are serious penalties, criminal penalties for an individual committing fraud in the election, a voting fraud or registration fraud. On the other hand, that's one vote. Is it criminal to hire people or to be hired to do extreme gerrymandering? And if it's not, and are there proportionate penalties? And if it's not criminal, can you explain why one is criminal and the other is not?
It is not criminal. Pretty much, you may have noticed there's some differentiation in both of our presentations, because in one case there is actually relatively clear law that people can give you authoritative answers for, and here in the partisan gerrymandering space we're kind of still creating the law as we go. We know that even the justices that didn't want to knock maps down as partisan gerrymanders, they all agreed that excessive partisan gerrymandering violated the Constitution. That's a constitutional violation, but it's not a criminal one. My guess for why it wouldn't be criminal to partisan gerrymander is because in order for it to become criminal, the legislators that would be doing the partisan gerrymandering would have to pass a statute saying that it's criminal. So I don't think that's likely to happen.
Yes. Can I ask a question about voter fraud? And are you willing to say that there used to be voter fraud and you fixed it? Because I was in Chicago in the 70s, where it was pretty well acknowledged that everybody would get out early and vote often. And, Daley and his team and the Democrats had really turned out the machine. Yeah, it was felt that there was a lot of voter fraud. Are you saying there wasn't, or was it fixed?
So I'm definitely not saying there has never been voter fraud, as technology has actually made it a lot more difficult to commit voter fraud. Again, I'm going to go back to the voter lists. In most countries in the world, there is one voter list, one central election authority, one citizen registry. Before 2005 in this country, there were literally nearly 10,000 voter lists in the United States. Each individual election jurisdiction in the United States had its own voter list. If you moved from one county to another, you were probably on two voter lists, not because you committed fraud, you did what you were supposed to do, you registered to vote, but because the counties didn't get their act together and compare lists at any point in time. Even though we had databases by that point in time, maybe it's a little more understandable when these voter lists were kept in file cabinets, but by 2005 they weren't. There was a law that passed the Help America Vote Act that starting in 2005 required states to have a statewide voter registration database. California being, and I'm a Californian, I should just say to start out with, but California being so technologically advanced, they eventually got their act together to do it by 2015, 10 years later. But the advent of statewide voter registration databases makes it very, very difficult to commit the kind of fraud that might have been seen in some places, and I don't want to mention, but everyone always mentions 1960 Chicago, so I'll go ahead and say that. But in other places in the country where machine politics often did lead to an abuse of the system, really through kind of political party machine conspiracies that occurred, where you needed to have the cooperation and collaboration of election officials themselves in order to do that, because they were part of the political machine. One of the things that has come about in the last probably 30 to 40 years is the professionalism in the election administrator ranks. These are no longer political patronage appointments to the same degree that they were before. They're often election professionals who have come in. There's professional organizations of election officials all over the country, and also media scrutiny is a lot more than it used to be. It's a lot harder to get away with this. The adversarial system in this way often works. I mean, if we saw a Democratic Party machine working to do something like this, we would sure as hell hear about it on Fox News and vice versa on MSNBC. So I think there are a variety of reasons that we don't see this anymore, and we really haven't seen any kind of conspiratorial mass fraud of that sort for many decades because of technology and professionalism and a variety of other reasons.
Two people want to do a question, so we go for ladies first.
Okay. Mr. Becker, you said 70% of U.S. voters vote on paper. So I haven't voted anywhere but New Jersey, and I vote in a machine, and that does have a tape that comes out at the end. Is that what you mean by there's a paper record?
So the vast majority of those who vote by paper mark what's called an optical scan ballot, which is a piece of paper that you take a pen and you'll mark on. Sometimes you connect an arrow, sometimes you fill in a bubble. In that 70 to 75% of people who vote on paper, we are including the number of people who vote on an electronic device that creates a paper record that can be audited. Because one of the things that's very, very difficult, as long as it's voter verified, meaning that the voter can see what's on the paper before it goes out of their control, as long as it's voter verified, that is a check on the system that can actually be used for recounts, that can be used for audits, as opposed to just trusting the electronic tally that would be in a paperless, they're called DREs, direct recording electronic devices, or more commonly touchscreen devices. If you don't have paper, then you're just a recount on a paperless touchscreen device is you just hit the button again to get the totals, and there's no way to see what happened inside that box. A recount in a jurisdiction with a papered DRE or optical scan, you're not looking at the tabulators, you're looking at the paper to confirm that the tabulators actually counted them correctly. So again, that's not enough. We got to get to the point where it's 100% or nearly 100%. One caveat here is that people with disabilities often need systems that don't rely fully on paper, because paper is not accessible media for them, for some people with disabilities. But for almost all voters, they should have a paper ballot that can then be used to audit later. Hopefully we'll move to a day where paper is not the only way to audit it, but paper right now is the best and most expensive way or most inexpensive way to audit a system.
Yeah, hello. Simple but very complicated question, to both of you. What are we to do about this? Now, one way is to be educated, and I'd like to thank both of you for an incredible presentation that educated everybody here, that we need to pass on. From David, in a simplistic way, I'm going to encourage people to vote, because if there's fear mongering or fear about voter fraud, it's basically non-existent. So go out and vote and don't worry about the fraud. And to Tom, in terms of gerrymandering, it seems to be in the hands of the courts and the lawyers, but our job is to educate people more and more about extreme gerrymandering, because at one point during the presentation you said that the public is angry about it, and the more we reach out, the more they understand, and the more the Supreme Court or any court may be influenced by that unfairness, unconstitutional, or un-American part of the system.
Sure, I can go first.
What do we do with it?
Right. So on a few notes, yes. I mean, I think right now the court has its hand on a very tremendous lever. But I think this actually relates to the first question I got from earlier about what we want our fair districting processes to look like. And some of this is through voters using their voices to make clear to legislators what we care about when they are doing their normal day-to-day legislation and when they're redistricting. So from my standpoint, this is sort of what I have arrived at during my time at the Brennan Center. Mainly what we're looking for is we want maps that are representative of the electorate, and that allow the electorate to hold their legislators accountable. And to the extent that you live in a state where you have individual politicians who have some hand in constituting who sits on these commissions and making it very clear to them that redistricting is a political decision or a policy decision, just like any number of other things they could act on, like property taxes or, you name it. That's something that we'll attempt to hold them accountable for. Pennsylvania, I think, is a good example of this. So Pennsylvania does not have a ballot initiative. So they're pushing to get legislators to put constitutional amendments in order that then would have to be approved on the back end through a referendum. And that's something that is going to take several elections, but they've already got hundreds of people who are out there really working with individual legislators in a targeted way to make it clear to them what they care about. And I think that's a way of kind of rebuilding a culture around redistricting, where it's no longer this thing that's done in the secret room or the back room by party leadership, but it's that they're doing for their benefit. Instead, it's something that the legislators or their representatives who are sitting at the table are doing for citizens, and they're doing it to support our constitutional values rather than undercut them.
I'll just say there's a couple of facts I want to throw out there. The first fact is voters in the United States don't need another reason not to vote. We already know that's epidemic. Another fact is there's literally no one happier when Americans are fighting over which reason our democracy is crumbling, whether it's cyber threats and hacking or widespread voter fraud, than Vladimir Putin and his allies in the Kremlin. So I think it's incumbent upon us to fight back by, where possible, working with our election officials, educating about it. If you can, please serve as a poll worker. That is something everyone can tangibly do. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not going to be a visit to Disneyland, but it is incredibly important. And so many people who do that end up feeling like they've really contributed to our democracy, and not just for presidential elections, for the small elections too. It's just as important to do that. You'll see the process in a way that you never have before. But also share information that's balanced with your fellow citizens, and let them know that they should vote, that they shouldn't be worried that their vote isn't going to count, or that the Russians are going to change the vote totals, or that people are going to be bussed in from another state to alter the votes. There's no evidence that that's changing outcomes in any kind of way, and it's really, really important to vote. And I'll make even another pitch, and it relates to gerrymandering. There is another way to combat gerrymandering. It gets harder with extreme gerrymandering, but it's possible. And that is by changing the turnout dynamic. Because every piece of data that these people are looking at when they're doing, and I've drawn maps, that was what I did at the DOJ. I would actually draw maps at times and use this software. They're all based on historical turnout. And they're looking at a variety of different ways, and they might do some hypothetical turnouts. But if you blow up the turnout models, you get a 2006 election where the Republicans gerrymandered in the 2000 cycle, but the Democrats won in the House. Or you get a 1994 election where the Democrats had gerrymandered the heck out of the 1990 maps, but the Republicans won the House in 1994. Why? Because the turnout dynamic changed. And now, granted, they didn't have the tools that they have now. They have much more sophisticated tools. So the turnout dynamic's going to have to change radically. But turnout is another tool that can be used against gerrymandering if we can manage to get that level of turnout.
Oh, and sorry, one other thing I'd throw in. This is sort of like a dirty little secret of electoral politics is that not all elections are created equal. Redistricting is pegged to the census, so we're going to have another census in 2020. I'm hoping it's done right. Certain indications now suggest there may be some problems with it, but let's assume it goes off without a hitch. That means that in 2011, the maps are going to be redrawn all around the country, including here, on the basis of what we know about our population. That means that the elections we have starting this year, with their gubernatorial races, there are two of them, Virginia and New Jersey, going forward, many legislative races kind of on a rolling basis over the next 2 to 3 years are going to determine who's at the table when it is time to redistrict. So there's kind of a bonus attached to elections over the next few years. If you really want to make sure that your processes are done fairly, you should make it an issue, and you should make it clear to people who are running, and then you should turn out to vote for them over the next few years to make sure you have the right people in charge.
How many people, raise your hand I want to know how many people still have questions. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think we can take those 4. All right, we'll take those 4 questions, and then we'll call it a night.
So I just wanted to also thank you for a great presentation to this very self-selected audience. And you know, I think that I'm very concerned with voter apathy also, but I think a lot of it also has to do with basically ignorance and how our democracy works amongst the masses, and ignorance as to why it's been so successful. And to some extent, like, I think that's a failure in our education system and a failure to have civics and constitutional law, government as part of a core curriculum in colleges. So to get ahead of this problem, rather than have to work with myths of voter fraud or gerrymandering after the fact, just like your opinions on that.
I'll just say that's absolutely right. I mean, there's no question about that. But we often have rose-colored glasses when we look at past participation levels. As I mentioned, we saw very low turnout in the 40s at times. Anyone want to guess the last time we saw 80% turnout in a federal election? It was 1888. Think about that. First of all, most women couldn't vote in the United States, 18-year-olds couldn't vote in the United States, and most African Americans couldn't vote in the United States at that point in time. It's pretty easy to 88% or 80% turnout in 1888 when your denominator is that low. I mean, that's something that we had the advantage of. But I will say this, there are going to be over 50 million Americans who voted in November 2016 who decide not to vote in November 2018. They are registered. They have ID if they need to show ID. They know where their polling place is. They're getting information in the mail about what's on their ballot. They know how to operate the machines. And there is some kind of subconscious or conscious decision being made in those individuals that caused them to vote in November 2016, and 700 days later, they're not going to show up to vote. 50 million Americans. That is the question. And by the way, I have no clue why. I can't tell you, and no one else can either. And a lot of people will tell you there's one magic reason those people don't vote. And by the way, that magic reason is always going to be different. There is no magic reason. This is a complex sociological, psychological, and societal problem that we have. And these reasons are going to be different for other people. And those are the people that I'm really thinking about. Because those are people who have already taken that initial first step to vote at least once every 4 years. Why are they not doing it more often? We have no idea, and we should have an idea, because we might be able to move turnout in a midterm election beyond 36% if we can get that.
I think just to add, one thing that's interesting, both of our presentations really emphasized at the top that there are these sort of hot button terms that get people really animated, but when you start kind of picking through what they're thinking about when they say these things, people mean all different kinds of things. There's a tremendous amount of popular interest in these topics. Like when we put things out on partisan gerrymandering, I've been talking about Twitter a lot tonight, but I mean, it's something that gets people really, really animated, and that gives you an entry point to start talking to people about the issues. And I think the key there is to sort of realize that a lot of people are feeling disempowered and disenchanted, and there's an opportunity there to start educating people about concretely what the problems are, concretely what we can do about some of them, what we can do, the other things that we can do about others, and attempt to energize people around that. I mean, most of my experience in elections came initially through political organizing, and it seemed like models that are based on individual people speaking to individual people actually can be very powerful for changing people's minds and animating them to action. So the fact that you're spending your Thursday night listening to us speak is already equipping you to kind of speak to the next person and the next person and kind of impart to them what they need to know too.
Okay, I think there were 2 more people had questions.
I think, for me, the third rail that hasn't been spoken about, and you've inferred a little bit, David, is what I'm going to call the anti-voter fraud. And I raise that as a personal example. My daughter was a freshman in college last year in Richmond, Virginia, And she and several dozen other students went to vote in their first election, and they weren't allowed to vote. They were told they weren't registered. They had gone through all the right processes, that they had their IDs, and they still weren't allowed to vote. So I have this concern that there are a lot of people that are intending to vote and can't vote, and I am concerned about that. And
yeah, I mean, it's a good point. So I want to separate two different things out from there. There is no question that there are individuals that face barriers in some cases when they attempt to vote. And it's particularly important when it's first-time voters, because if they get a bad taste in their mouth the first time, there's a lot of those people that aren't going to come back. Some of those barriers might be legislative and institutional with restrictive ID or registration restrictions or other things. Some of them might be poll worker error, something that they just got wrong. Maybe they were supposed to be able to vote and the poll worker got it wrong and didn't give them a provisional ballot like they should have been given under federal law, which they're supposed to be given. Every single person who thinks they're entitled to vote, if you're told you can't, you must be given a provisional ballot. Now, sometimes it's a placebo because it might be that provisional ballot won't count, but at least you're supposed to be given that provisional ballot. But sometimes that's conflated with this bigger term of massive vote suppression. And what's usually behind that term is the idea that this vote suppression is changing outcomes of elections. There was literally a piece that was just put out today on Mother Jones about this in Wisconsin. I will tell you, from my perspective, there is very little evidence of that. There is very little evidence that supports the idea that systemic voter suppression is changing the outcomes of elections. So to me, this is not a political issue. And a lot of people put it as a political issue. Hillary lost Wisconsin because of voter ID. That's what was said in this piece. I do not believe the evidence supports that. But if there's one person who was eligible to vote and couldn't, that's a moral problem. And that we as a democracy need to be encouraging those people, not because it means that our candidate lost but for that person voting, but because even if that person was going to vote for the other side, we're stronger as a democracy when those people vote. I will say this, and I mean it 100%. Some people don't believe me when I say this. I would be much happier with 100% turnout if my candidate losing than 50% turnout and my candidate winning, because our democracy is stronger in that kind of environment. And that means that the thankfully relatively small percentage of people that face the barriers that you're talking about, but whatever that percentage, whether it's 0.001% or 1% or 10%, that number's too high. So we need to find ways to fix that.
Well, there's one way you can fix it right away, to do what Australia, South America, and New Zealand is doing, and makes mandatory to vote. They actually have to pay about $200 if they don't vote. But I want to actually get back to Tom and a gentleman back there. Can you hear me? What can be done with gerrymandering? I belong to an organization in one of our counties here. We have drawn up a letter that has encourages all the candidates for this year's election to work on their stance to be anti-gerrymandering. That went out to all candidates, and in addition, we just send it to the media as well, so it's a cross-reference. And we had collected over 1,200 signatures in a very short period of time. And an interesting thing happened along the way. People either had no clue what gerrymandering was about, or the ones who knew about it really hated it. So that picks up what you were saying earlier. So you can indeed do something by thinking globally and acting locally. And our all candidates, doesn't matter which party, got our petition, and they know that we're watching.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I realize you're not asking a question, I just want to reflect back. I mean, yeah, I think that you need to surface the issue, and you need to make it clear to people what your values are and what you'll accept from your legislators and what you won't. Chief Justice Roberts, at this oral argument we've now referred to a few times, one of the concerns he voiced was, if we knock down a map as being unconstitutional, how will the intelligent person in the street he actually said man, but we'll assume he said person. How would the intelligent person in the street understand this? Like, what's the principle? We can't just do it because some numbers tell us. The principle is pretty simple. Entrenchment is wrong and it violates the Constitution. And making sure that you're not talking to people about all these kind of obscure constitutional facts. People understand at a very, very basic, visceral level that they should choose their legislators, not the other way around, that our maps should be accountable and they should be representative. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Just because it's been the kind of standard way politicians have been doing business doesn't mean that it's right, and it doesn't mean that it should continue. So.
Before we take our last question, I want to remind everybody that this program is being videotaped, and it will be on our website for those of you that want to go back to it, or in fact have a group meeting in your home or your local community center and invite people to view that video. I think it's very worthwhile. These guys did a great job, and we learned a lot. So now for our last question.
My question is related to voting reform and voter reform at state levels. And we had the pleasure of having Jonathan Brader from the Brennan Center come speak to us and tell us about things that are going on in other states, like Oregon and places where they are making changes in the laws to do things that either give you more time to vote or let you vote from home automatically. So are there more efforts going on in states that might create sort of a way to counteract this kind of gerrymandering? Because then we as individuals can really feel like we're making a difference.
Yes, so there are both ballot initiatives that folks are pursuing and also legislation. And part of what's happening right now, and this is part of the work we do at the Brennan Center, is advising and educating folks that want to do these sorts of things to try to figure out ways to deal intelligently and effectively with the issues. So in a few months, we're going to be releasing a report that's the first of its kind. It's a qualitative assessment of commissions with a focus on California. And what that report's going to do is sort of walk through some of the major features of good commissions and the sorts of ways we'd want to design our reforms to make sure that we can produce maps that are fairer, more accountable, more representative. Some of these ideas already have currency, and so question whether any of the normal legislation will pass, but those ideas are out there. With the ballot initiatives are very difficult to get through. In Michigan, you need to get 315,000 signatures to get it on the ballot. You also need to spend money organizing the folks to go out and get the signatures, advertising, educating people. It's very expensive. The California Commission cost upwards of $10 million from the start of the process to the end. That means finding the commissioners, training them, producing the maps. Most of that money was provided by outside philanthropic groups to do outreach, to recruit, and to educate people. So these are not easy. They require a lot of manpower or person power, and they require a lot of money in a lot of cases. But there is momentum there. People are increasingly realizing there's something wrong here. And I think in part it has to do with a combination of the dysfunction we're seeing in Congress and in our state legislatures, increasing polarization, and the fact that the problem is just getting worse. We didn't have extreme gerrymandering 150 years ago, but we have it now, and we're probably going to have it again. So there's kind of like a, like a pot boiling or something. And so there's movement.
Okay, thank you. And a reminder to come back here on November 2nd